The fluorescent lights of Murphy's diner flickered against the November evening, casting uneven shadows across worn vinyl booths and chipped formica tables. Outside, the first frost of winter painted delicate patterns on glass windows, while inside, the warmth carried the aroma of coffee and grilled onions. It was the kind of place where stories unfolded quietly, where ordinary moments transformed into extraordinary memories. At a corner booth near the window sat a young black boy, maybe 14, his thin frame almost swallowed by an oversized jacket that had seen too many winters. His name was Terrell Washington, and in front of him sat a plate that represented everything he had worked for that week. A cheeseburger, golden fries, and a chocolate milkshake, simple foods that most took for granted, but for Terrell, this was a feast earned through countless hours of raking leaves, shoveling driveways, and collecting bottles for recycling. His stomach growled with a hunger that had been his constant companion for days, yet his eyes weren't focused on his own plate. Instead, they drifted to the booth directly across from him, where an elderly couple sat in silence. The man wore a threadbare coat that hung loose on his shrinking frame, while the woman beside him clutched a purse so worn the leather had cracked into intricate patterns. Their booth was empty except for 2 glasses of water, and the quiet dignity in their posture spoke volumes about pride maintained in the face of hardship. Terrell lifted his fork, the metal cool against his fingers, and hesitated. The elderly woman's eyes met his for just a moment, and in that brief connection, he saw something that made his heart skip. It wasn't just hunger, it was the careful resignation of people who had learned to expect nothing while hoping for everything. The man reached across the table to squeeze his wife's hand, a gesture so tender and protective that it made Terrell's chest tighten. What happened next in that small-town diner would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of what Terrell thought he knew about kindness, sacrifice, and the mysterious ways that goodness finds its way back to those who need it most. It was a decision that would bring a millionaire to his door and change his life forever, but more than that, it would prove that even in our darkest moments, even when we have almost nothing left to give, the human heart has an infinite capacity for love. Before we see what choice this remarkable young man makes in this pivotal moment, I want to ask you something that I think about every time I tell these stories. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where doing the right thing meant sacrificing something that you desperately needed for yourself? Maybe it was your last $20, maybe it was your time, maybe it was something even more precious. Those moments define us, don't they? They reveal who we really are when nobody's watching and there's no guarantee of reward. Drop a comment below and share your story with our community. What was a time when you chose kindness over self-preservation? I read every single comment, and these stories of human goodness never fail to restore my faith in the world. And if you're here for the first time, drawn in by this tale of unexpected compassion, then you've found your tribe. Hit that subscribe button right now because every Tuesday and Friday, we dive deep into these incredible true stories that remind us why kindness matters. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. The fork trembled slightly in Terrell's grip as the internal battle raged within him. His stomach cramped with hunger, reminding him that he hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. This cheeseburger wasn't just food, it was the culmination of a week's worth of back-breaking work, of knocking on doors until his knuckles were raw, of enduring the suspicious glances of neighbors who wondered what a young black boy was doing in their pristine suburbia. He had raked Mrs. Henderson's entire backyard for $5, spending 3 hours collecting leaves that seemed to multiply the moment he turned his back. He had helped Mr. Rodriguez move furniture for another 10, his thin arms straining under the weight of sofas and dressers. Every dollar had been earned through sweat and determination, and this meal was supposed to be his reward, his one moment of indulgence in a life that offered precious few pleasures. But as Terrell watched the elderly couple, he noticed details that pierced straight through his own discomfort. The way the woman's fingers traced the edge of her empty coffee cup, as if the motion could somehow fill it. The way the man's shoulders hunched forward, not from age alone but from the weight of watching his wife go without. The way they both kept glancing at other diners' plates with a hunger that went beyond mere appetite, it was the deep, aching need of people who remembered when meals were regular, when dignity didn't require choosing between food and rent. The woman caught Terrell looking and offered him a weak smile, the kind that elderly people give to young ones even when their own world is crumbling. It was a smile that said, "Don't worry about us, child." We've lived our lives. But in her eyes, Terrell saw something different. He saw his own grandmother, who had passed 3 years earlier, who had often gone without so that he and his mother could eat. He saw the same quiet strength, the same refusal to burden others with their struggles. Without a word, without any grand gesture or dramatic pause, Terrell simply stood up. The movement felt natural, inevitable, as if some invisible string was pulling him forward. He picked up his plate, the cheeseburger still steaming, the fries golden and crispy, the milkshake thick with promise, and walked the 3 steps to their booth. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow cutting through the diner's ambient noise. "I noticed you folks might be hungry, and I've already eaten more than I should today." The lie came easily, born from a desire to preserve their dignity. "Would you mind helping me out by finishing this? I hate to see food go to waste." The elderly man's eyes widened, and his wife's hand flew to her throat in surprise. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the sizzle from the kitchen grill and the distant hum of traffic outside. Then the old man's lips began to tremble, and when he spoke, his voice cracked like autumn leaves. "Son," he whispered, "we couldn't possibly—" "Please," Terrell interrupted gently, setting the plate on their table with the careful reverence of someone placing flowers on a grave. "It would mean a lot to me. My grandmother always said food tastes better when it's shared with good people." The woman's eyes filled with tears that she tried desperately to hide, dabbing at them with a napkin that had seen too much use. "What's your name, young man?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Terrell. Terrell Washington, ma'am." "Well, Terrell Washington," the old man said, extending a weathered hand, "I'm Harold, and this is my wife, Dorothy. We thank you. More than you'll ever know." Terrell shook the man's hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of a lifetime of honest work, the slight tremor that came with age and perhaps malnutrition. "You don't need to thank me, sir. Just enjoy it, okay?" He turned to leave, but Dorothy's voice stopped him. "Wait, sweetheart. How can we ever repay this kindness?" Terrell looked back over his shoulder, his stomach growling loudly enough that he was sure they could hear it, but his smile was genuine and warm. "Just pay it forward someday, Mrs. Dorothy. That's all any of us can do." As Terrell walked toward the diner's exit, his footsteps seemed to echo louder than they should. He passed other diners who were absorbed in their own meals, their own conversations, their own lives. None of them noticed the quiet transaction that had just taken place, the moment when a hungry boy chose compassion over comfort, love over logic. Harold and Dorothy watched him go, their eyes following his thin frame until he disappeared into the cold November night. The cheeseburger sat before them, still warm, still perfect, but somehow transformed into something more than food. It had become a gift, a bridge between strangers, a testament to the fact that poverty of circumstance need never mean poverty of spirit. "Harold," Dorothy whispered, her voice barely audible, "what just happened here?" Her husband was already cutting the burger in half with the side of his fork, his movements careful and deliberate. "I think," he said slowly, "we just met an angel who doesn't know he has wings." They ate in reverent silence, savoring not just the flavors but the kindness that seasoned every bite. And though they couldn't have known it in that moment, their quiet prayers of gratitude were already setting in motion events that would reach far beyond that small diner, far beyond that cold November night, and into the very heart of what it means to recognize goodness when it appears in the most unexpected forms. The cold November air hit Terrell like a physical blow as he stepped out of Murphy's Diner, but it was nothing compared to the emptiness that gnawed at his insides. His stomach cramped with hunger, a sensation that had become so familiar it felt like an old friend, unwelcome but constant. He pulled his oversized jacket tighter around his thin frame and began the long walk home through streets that seemed to grow more desolate with each passing block. Terrell Washington lived in a world where every dollar had a destination before it was earned, where dreams were luxuries that competed with necessities like electricity and rent. At 14, he possessed a wisdom that most adults never acquire, the knowledge that survival requires sacrifice, and that sometimes the greatest strength comes from having nothing left to lose. His home sat at the end of Maple Street, where the asphalt gave way to gravel and the streetlights grew sparse. It was a small house with peeling paint and a roof that leaked when the rains came hard, but it was theirs, his and his mother's, and that made it more valuable than any mansion. The front porch sagged slightly under the weight of too many seasons, and the screen door hung at an angle that spoke of repairs delayed by necessity, but when Terrell looked at it, he saw home. Inside, the living room was lit by a single lamp, its warm glow barely reaching the corners where shadows gathered like old memories. On the worn sofa sat his mother, Denise Washington, her nurse's uniform wrinkled from a double shift at the county hospital. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted back against a cushion that had lost its shape years ago, but Terrell could tell by the tension in her shoulders that she wasn't really sleeping, just resting her eyes while her mind continued to work through the endless calculations of a single mother trying to stretch too little money across too many needs. At 32, Denise looked older than her years. The lines around her eyes spoke of nights spent worrying, of decisions made in the harsh light of financial reality. Her hands, even in rest, showed the wear of constant work, cleaning, caring, providing in whatever way she could for the son who had become both her greatest joy and her deepest concern. Terrell moved quietly through the house, his footsteps soft on linoleum that curled at the edges. The kitchen was immaculate despite its age, every surface clean and organized in the way that comes from taking pride in what little you have. On the counter sat a single envelope, and Terrell didn't need to open it to know what it contained, another bill, another reminder of money they didn't have, another weight to add to his mother's already heavy burden. He thought about waking her, about sharing the warmth of human connection after his act of kindness at the diner, but the exhaustion etched into her features stopped him. Instead, he pulled a thin blanket from the hall closet and draped it gently over her shoulders, watching as some of the tension left her face in sleep. The house held secrets in its silence, the sound of a boy growing up too fast, of a mother working herself to the bone, of dreams deferred but never quite abandoned. In Terrell's small bedroom, schoolbooks competed for space with job applications he was too young to submit legally. His bed was a mattress on the floor, but the walls were covered with articles about college, about scholarships, about young people who had overcome circumstances similar to his own. Education was Terrell's obsession, his religion, his hope for a future different from his present. Every night, after completing whatever work he could find, he would spread his homework across that mattress and study by the light of a desk lamp salvaged from a garage sale. Mathematics, science, literature, he consumed knowledge with the same desperate hunger that gnawed at his stomach, understanding instinctively that learning was the one currency that couldn't be taken away. His grades were exceptional, a source of pride that his teachers at Jefferson High School never failed to mention during parent conferences that his mother attended still wearing her hospital scrubs. But grades, no matter how perfect, required money to translate into opportunity. College applications cost money. SAT prep courses cost money. Even the dream of higher education, it seemed, required a down payment that the Washington family couldn't afford. The irony wasn't lost on Terrell. He worked constantly to earn money for college, but that same work often kept him from the extracurricular activities and volunteer opportunities that scholarships required. It was a cruel cycle that trapped too many gifted young people in circumstances beyond their control. But tonight, as Terrell lay on his mattress staring at the ceiling where a water stain had taken the shape of something that might have been hope, he didn't think about scholarships or applications or the impossibility of his dreams. Instead, he thought about Harold and Dorothy, about the way their faces had transformed when kindness appeared unexpectedly in their lives. He thought about his empty stomach and his full heart, and somehow, the trade felt worth it. His mother stirred in the living room, mumbling something in her sleep about overtime hours and patient care, and Terrell felt the familiar surge of protective love that had driven so many of his decisions. She had given up everything for him, her youth, her dreams, her own chance at happiness, working multiple jobs to keep them afloat in a world that seemed determined to pull them under. The weight of that sacrifice pressed down on Terrell's chest like a physical thing. He was her investment, her hope, her reason for getting up at 5 in the morning to face another day of bedpans and demanding patients and supervisors who seemed to think that paying barely above minimum wage was generous. He was why she smiled through exhaustion, why she pretended not to notice when her own stomach growled, why she sat at their kitchen table long after he was asleep, moving numbers around on pieces of paper as if mathematics could somehow create money that didn't exist. In the darkness of his room, surrounded by dreams that seemed as distant as stars, Terrell made a promise that only he could hear. Whatever it took, however long it required, he would find a way to change their circumstances. He would become someone who could take care of his mother the way she had taken care of him. He would prove that her sacrifices hadn't been in vain, that love and determination could overcome even the most stubborn obstacles. Outside his window, the November wind rattled the glass, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled midnight. It was a new day, filled with new possibilities and new challenges, and Terrell Washington was ready to meet them head-on, armed with nothing more than hope, determination, and the unshakable belief that kindness, given and received, had the power to change everything. As sleep finally began to claim him, Terrell's last conscious thought was of Harold and Dorothy, and he wondered if they were somewhere warm tonight, their bellies full and their hearts lighter because a hungry boy had chosen their need over his own. It was a good thought to carry into dreams, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply care about each other. The house settled into the quiet rhythms of night, but even in sleep, both mother and son carried the weight of tomorrow's responsibilities, the burden of dreams deferred but never abandoned, and the unspoken faith that somehow, someday, their circumstances would change. They couldn't have known that change was already in motion, set in motion by a simple act of kindness in a diner where nobody was watching and nobody was keeping score. Nobody, that is, except the universe itself, which has its own mysterious ways of balancing the scales of justice and ensuring that goodness, no matter how quietly given, eventually finds its way home. Dawn broke slowly over Maple Street, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed too beautiful for such a humble neighborhood. The November morning carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and frost clung to car windshields like delicate lacework. Inside the small house at the end of the street, Terrell Washington stirred on his mattress, his stomach immediately reminding him of yesterday's sacrifice with a hollow ache that had become his alarm clock. He could hear his mother moving quietly in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of someone trying to prepare for another day while letting a loved one sleep just a few minutes longer. The smell of coffee, weak but warm, drifted through the thin walls, mingled with the faint aroma of toast made from bread that was probably a day past its prime but still good enough to provide sustenance. Terrell stretched, his joints protesting after a night on the thin mattress, and checked the digital clock that had been a gift from his mother 3 Christmases ago. 7:15. He had exactly 45 minutes before school started, just enough time to grab whatever breakfast they could afford and make the 20-minute walk to Jefferson High. But first, he needed to check if Mrs. Patterson down the street had any yard work. She sometimes paid him $5 to clear her walkway, and $5 was $5 closer to his college fund. As he pulled on yesterday's jeans and the same button-down shirt he'd worn for 3 days running, clean but starting to show the wear of being his only nice shirt, a sound cut through the morning quiet that made him freeze. It was authoritative, confident, completely out of place in their neighborhood of muffled conversations and apologetic knocks. Someone was at their front door. The knocking came again, 3 firm raps that seemed to echo through their small house like gunshots. Terrell heard his mother's footsteps pause in the kitchen, and he could picture her face, the immediate tension that crossed her features whenever unexpected visitors arrived. In their world, surprises were rarely good news. They were eviction notices and past due bills and social workers with clipboards and concerned expressions. Terrell, his mother's voice carried the careful neutrality she perfected over years of protecting him from adult worries. "Are you expecting anyone?" "No, ma'am," he called back, pulling on his jacket and moving toward the living room where his mother stood frozen by the kitchen doorway, still holding the coffee cup that had become more prop than beverage, something to warm her hands around while she gathered courage to face whatever waited on the other side of their door. The knocking came a third time, patient but insistent, and with it came a voice that seemed to carry the weight of authority and education. "Excuse me, is this the Washington residence? I'm looking for Terrell Washington." Denise's eyes went wide with the kind of panic that comes from years of being unable to afford whatever trouble might be calling their name. She set down her coffee cup with trembling hands and smoothed her hair, still wearing the scrubs she'd fallen asleep in, still carrying the exhaustion of another double shift in the lines around her eyes. "What did you do?" she whispered to Terrell, but there was no accusation in her voice, only the weary concern of a mother who had spent 14 years protecting her son from a world that seemed determined to knock him down. "Nothing, Mama. I swear." And it was true. Terrell couldn't think of any reason why someone would be at their door asking for him by name. His grades were good, he'd never been in trouble at school, and his part-time jobs were all cash under-the-table arrangements that kept him below any official radar. Together, they approached the front door, their footsteps careful and quiet on the worn linoleum. Through the thin curtain that covered the door's small window, they could make out shapes, multiple figures, which only added to their anxiety. In their experience, people who came in groups rarely brought good news. Denise reached for the doorknob, her hand shaking slightly, then paused and looked at her son. In that moment, Terrell saw not the strong, determined woman who had raised him single-handedly, but a scared 32-year-old who still sometimes felt like the teenager she'd been when he was born. He reached out and squeezed her shoulder, trying to give her some of the strength she'd always given him. "It's okay, Mama. Whatever it is, we'll handle it together." She nodded, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The morning light seemed to frame the three figures standing on their small porch like a tableau from a dream. In the center stood a tall man, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing a charcoal wool overcoat that probably cost more than their monthly rent. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his posture spoke of confidence born from success, and his eyes, sharp and intelligent, seemed to take in everything about their modest home without a trace of judgment. But it was the couple flanking him that made Terrell's breath catch in his throat. Harold and Dorothy stood there, transformed from the desperate strangers he'd met in the diner. They wore clean clothes that, while still modest, carried the dignity of people who had been given the gift of hope. Harold's shoulders were straighter, Dorothy's eyes brighter, and both of them were looking at Terrell with expressions that mixed gratitude, amazement, and something that looked remarkably like pride. "Mrs. Washington," the man in the expensive coat asked, his voice carrying the cultured tones of someone accustomed to boardrooms and negotiations. "My name is Robert Sterling. I believe your son met my parents last night." The word parents hit Terrell like a physical blow. He looked from the well-dressed man to Harold and Dorothy, seeing now the resemblance that hadn't been apparent in the diner's dim lighting, the same intelligent eyes, the same determined set to the jaw, the same aura of quiet dignity that no amount of hardship could completely erode. "I don't understand," Denise said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at Terrell with confusion and growing concern. "What happened last night? What parents?" Before Terrell could answer, Dorothy stepped forward, her face glowing with the kind of joy that comes from witnessing something truly miraculous. "Mrs. Washington," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "your son is an angel. An absolute angel." Harold nodded vigorously, his weathered hands clasped together as if in prayer. "Ma'am, we haven't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. Harold and I, we've been going through some hard times since I lost my job at the textile mill. We went to that diner last night not because we could afford to eat, but because it was warm and we had nowhere else to go. We ordered 2 cups of coffee," Dorothy continued, thinking we could make them last for hours, but even that was stretching our budget. "We were just sitting there, trying to stay warm, trying to maintain some shred of dignity while our stomachs cramped with hunger." Robert Sterling watched his parents speak, his expression softening with each word. When they paused, he stepped forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. "What they're not telling you, Mrs. Washington, is that I've been searching for them for weeks. I've hired private investigators, put ads in newspapers, done everything I could think of to find them and bring them home." Terrell felt his mother's eyes boring into him, demanding an explanation for this surreal scene unfolding on their doorstep. He swallowed hard, his throat dry with nervousness and confusion. He started, then stopped, unsure how to explain the simple impulse that had driven him to give away his only meal. "I saw they were hungry, and I had food. It seemed like the right thing to do." The words hung in the air like the morning mist, simple and honest and somehow profound in their very simplicity. Robert Sterling studied Terrell's face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading people, to understanding character and motivation with the quick assessment that had made him successful in business. The right thing to do, he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of each word. Do you know, young man, that I've spent the last 20 years in boardrooms full of people who wouldn't give up their lunch to save a starving man? I've met politicians and CEOs and celebrities, and I can count on one hand the number of them who would have done what you did last night. Denise was looking back and forth between her son and these strangers, trying to process information that seemed to come from some alternate reality where their small, struggling world intersected with success and wealth and mysterious acts of kindness. I still don't understand, she said, her voice carrying the careful control of someone who had learned not to hope too much, not to expect too much, because disappointment was a luxury she couldn't afford. Who are you people? What do you want with my son? Robert Sterling smiled then, the kind of smile that transformed his entire face and revealed the man he must have been before success hardened him, before wealth insulated him from the raw humanity that his parents had encountered in a small-town diner. Mrs. Washington, he said, I want to tell you about a conversation I had with my parents this morning at 6 a.m., when they called me from a payphone outside that diner, crying so hard I could barely understand what they were saying. The morning air seemed to hold its breath as Robert Sterling continued, his voice carrying the weight of revelation and the promise of transformation. Terrell felt his mother's hand find his arm, her grip tight with the kind of tension that comes from standing on the edge of something that could either save you or destroy you. My parents, Robert said, his eyes moving between Harold and Dorothy with a mixture of love and regret, are two of the most stubborn, proud people you'll ever meet. When the textile mill closed and my father lost his job after 37 years, they refused my help. They sold their house, used up their savings, and when that ran out, they started living in their car rather than burden their successful son. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but she lifted her chin with the dignity that poverty could diminish but never destroy. We raised our boy to be independent, she said softly. We didn't want him thinking we were failures just because the world changed around us. For 3 weeks, Robert continued, his voice cracking slightly, they've been homeless. 3 weeks of sleeping in parking lots, eating from dollar menus when they could afford it, going to places like Murphy's Diner just to sit somewhere warm and pretend they belonged. I had detectives looking for them, but they kept moving, kept staying one step ahead because they knew I'd try to force them to accept help. Terrell's stomach twisted as he began to understand the magnitude of what Harold and Dorothy had been facing, the depth of desperation that had brought them to that diner booth. His simple act of kindness suddenly felt both more significant and less sufficient. When they called me this morning, Robert said, pulling out his phone and showing them a recent call log with multiple missed calls from an unknown number, they were sobbing. Not just because a stranger had fed them, but because that stranger was a 14-year-old boy who clearly had less than they did but gave anyway. They said it restored their faith in humanity, but more than that, it made them realize something important about pride in family and accepting love when it's offered. Harold stepped forward then, his voice stronger than it had been the night before, strengthened by food and sleep and the restoration of hope. That boy, he said, pointing at Terrell with a trembling finger, that boy reminded us that receiving kindness isn't weakness. It's part of being human. When he gave us his meal, he didn't see 2 old people who had failed. He saw 2 people who needed help, and he helped without question, without judgment. It made us realize, Dorothy added, her voice growing stronger with each word, that maybe accepting help from our son wasn't admitting failure. Maybe it was allowing him to show the same kind of love we'd tried to teach him his whole life. Robert Sterling nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. So at 7 this morning, instead of running from me, they called. They told me about Terrell Washington, about a boy who gave up his only meal for strangers, and they said if there were still people like that in the world, then maybe there was hope for all of us. The weight of the story settled over the small porch like a blessing, transforming what had started as confusion into something approaching magic. But Robert Sterling wasn't finished. Mrs. Washington, he said, turning his full attention to Denise, I did some research this morning. I made some calls. I know about your son's grades, his work ethic, his dreams of college. I know about your double shifts at the hospital, your sacrifice, the way you've built something beautiful out of circumstances that would have broken most people. Denise's composure finally cracked, and tears began to stream down her face. "What are you saying?" she whispered. Robert Sterling reached into his coat and withdrew a manila envelope, thick with documents and official-looking papers. "I'm saying that kindness should be rewarded. I'm saying that young men like your son are exactly the kind of leaders this world needs. I'm saying that I want to offer Terrell a full scholarship to any university he chooses, with all expenses paid, plus a trust fund that will ensure your family never has to choose between dignity and survival again." The words seemed to hang in the air like something physical, like objects that could be touched and examined and verified. Terrell felt his knees go weak, and his mother's hand on his arm was the only thing that kept him upright. "I don't." Terrell started, then stopped, his voice caught somewhere between his heart and his throat. "I don't understand." "Why would you?" "Because," Robert Sterling said, stepping closer and placing a gentle hand on Terrell's shoulder, "yesterday you taught me something I'd forgotten in 20 years of business deals and profit margins. You reminded me that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It's measured in moments like the one you created in that diner. You didn't give those people food, you gave them hope. You didn't just feed their bodies, you restored their souls." Dorothy was openly crying now, her hands pressed to her mouth as if to contain the emotion that threatened to overflow. "He saved us," she whispered. "In every way a person can be saved." Harold nodded, his own eyes bright with tears. "And now we want to save him right back." The envelope in Robert Sterling's hands seemed to glow in the morning light, heavy with possibility and promise and the transformation of dreams into reality. But more than that, it represented something that transcended money or education or opportunity. It was proof that the universe has its own sense of justice, its own way of balancing the scales between those who give and those who receive. "There are conditions," Robert said, his voice taking on a slightly more businesslike tone. "I want you to maintain your grades. I want you to remember where you came from and help others when you can. And I want you to understand that this isn't charity, it's an investment in the kind of person you've already proven yourself to be." Terrell looked at his mother, seeing in her face the reflection of his own amazement and disbelief. 14 years of struggle, of choosing between wants and needs, of dreams that seemed as distant as stars, and suddenly a stranger was offering to make it all possible. "Why?" Denise asked, her voice barely audible. "Why would you do this for us?" Robert Sterling smiled, and in that smile was the echo of every parent who has ever wanted to build a better world for their children. "Because your son reminded me that the best investment isn't in stocks or bonds or real estate. It's in human potential. It's in young people who have the courage to do the right thing even when it costs them everything." He extended the envelope toward Terrell, but the boy hesitated, his eyes wide with the magnitude of what was being offered. "Take it," Harold said gently. "Let someone else's gratitude become your opportunity. Let our son's success honor the kindness you showed us." With trembling hands, Terrell reached out and accepted the envelope. It felt heavier than paper should, weighted with possibility and responsibility and the promise of a future that had suddenly become attainable. Stories like this stop me in my tracks every single time, and I have to pause here because I'm getting emotional just thinking about what we've witnessed. This is what happens when kindness meets opportunity, when someone's generosity creates a ripple effect that changes everything. Terrell's simple act of sharing his meal didn't just feed two hungry people, it revealed the kind of character that transforms lives and communities. But here's what I want you to think about as we continue this incredible story. How many times have you been in a position to help someone, maybe not in such a dramatic way, but in small, everyday moments? Maybe it was letting someone go ahead of you in line, maybe it was listening to a friend who needed to talk, maybe it was offering encouragement to someone who was struggling. Those moments matter more than we realize. They matter because kindness is never truly lost, it always finds a way back to us, sometimes in ways we could never imagine. Drop a comment right now and tell me about a time when your kindness came back to you unexpectedly. Or tell me about a moment when someone else's kindness changed your day, your perspective, or even your life. And if this story is filling you with the same hope and amazement that it's filling me with, then you absolutely need to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because we share these incredible true stories every Tuesday and Friday, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next in Terrell's journey. This is just the beginning of how one meal shared with strangers transformed not just a family, but an entire community. The news of Terrell Washington's scholarship spread through their small town like wildfire, but not in the way such stories usually travel. There were no newspaper headlines or television interviews, no social media posts or viral videos. Instead, it moved through the community the way important truths always do, quietly, person to person, in conversations over backyard fences and during coffee breaks at work. At Jefferson High School, Terrell found himself the reluctant center of attention in ways that made him deeply uncomfortable. Students who had never acknowledged his existence suddenly wanted to sit with him at lunch, teachers made pointed comments about exceptional character during class, and the guidance counselor called him to her office not to discuss problems but to celebrate possibilities. But it was the conversations with his classmates that revealed the true impact of his story. Maria Gonzalez, who sat behind him in chemistry class, quietly shared that she'd started volunteering at the food bank because if someone our age can give up his only meal, maybe I can give up my Saturday mornings. James Chen, captain of the debate team, admitted that Terrell's story had inspired him to start a tutoring program for younger students who couldn't afford private help. Most remarkably, a group of seniors organized what they called Terrell Tuesdays, weekly collections of canned goods and small donations that they distributed to families in need throughout the community. They insisted they weren't naming it after him to embarrass him, but because he'd shown them that age was no excuse for not making a difference. The ripple effects extended far beyond the school walls. At Murphy's Diner, owner Jake Murphy found himself dealing with an unexpected phenomenon. Customers began asking specifically to sit in the booth where Terrell had performed his act of kindness, and many began leaving extra-large tips specifically designated for any hungry customers who might not be able to afford their meals. "It's the strangest thing," Jake told anyone who would listen. "People come in here now looking for opportunities to help each other." Last week, a businessman paid for the meals of every customer who came in during the lunch rush. Said he'd heard about that Washington boy and wanted to do something good himself. The local Methodist church, where Denise had occasionally attended when her work schedule allowed, soon saw their Sunday services overflowing. Pastor Williams shared that donations to their food pantry had tripled, and the number of volunteers had grown fivefold. "People keep telling me they want to help," he said during one especially crowded sermon. "They say a young man showed them what real faith looks like in action." But the most profound transformation unfolded inside the Washington home. The trust fund Robert Sterling created allowed Denise to cut back on her exhausting double shifts at the hospital. For the first time in years, she had time to guide Terrell through college applications, to cook meals they could share, and to dream beyond day-to-day survival. Their house, once just a shelter, slowly became a true home. Denise even re-enrolled in night classes to finish her long-delayed nursing degree, while Terrell dove into his studies with new determination, knowing his success now carried the hopes of everyone who believed in him. The scholarship Robert offered opened doors to universities that once felt impossibly distant: Harvard, Stanford, MIT. Robert became not just a benefactor but a mentor, meeting Terrell monthly to talk about academics, service, and purpose. "Success without significance is just wealth," he often said. Harold and Dorothy Sterling, once hesitant to accept help, grew into loving grandparents to Terrell, their weekly dinners with the Washingtons becoming a cherished ritual filled with laughter, stories, and belonging. The ripple of Terrell's kindness soon reshaped their entire community. Local businesses partnered with schools to create internships and scholarships. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years began checking on one another, and food banks became flooded with donations and volunteers. Robert shared Terrell's story across the country, inspiring other business leaders to start scholarship programs of their own. Meanwhile, Terrell remained grounded. He still worked part-time jobs, not out of necessity but to honor the dignity of work. He tutored younger students for free, believing education was a gift to be shared. He spoke to school groups about how kindness matters more than wealth, telling them, "I just shared a meal, but you all chose to share the lesson that meal taught us." Denise thrived in her career as a pediatric charge nurse, grateful not just for financial security but for the time it gave her to be present for her son. The Sterlings became pillars of the local volunteer network, leading a pay-it-forward program at Murphy's Diner that had served thousands of meals to people in need. The diner booth where it all began now bears a small brass plaque that reads simply, "Reserved for anyone who needs a moment of kindness." Jake Murphy says the booth is rarely empty, not because people are eating there, but because they're connecting there. Strangers offering help to strangers. Communities forming around the simple recognition of shared humanity. The story has spread far beyond their small town, shared in graduation,